Most of you should remember when you registered, or maybe if it was a while ago, you might not, but we asked you what your burning questions were on these topics and what success would look like for coming out of the event. And so we went through all of that and really tried to design the agenda accordingly, and wanted to just reflect some of that back to you to see what others in the group were looking for and what was top of mind for them. So this is kind of a mix of the questions and what success would look like, but far and away, everybody wanted to make connections. So hopefully this format will really encourage that. A lot of desire to hear what other endowments were doing, what your peers are doing. So we've got some great case studies on the agenda, but again, a lot of that will come out through the conversations as well. Quite a bit around kind of related topics of data, measurement, transparency, reporting, both sort of in the finance industry in general, but also on the part of endowments to see what steps they're taking around these topics. Very solid interest in net zero, climate, divestment, as well as justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, which are sort of the key themes of the network. So that wasn't too much of a surprise. A lot of interest in kind of the broad governance and fiduciary duty piece. Quite a bit on the anti-ESG political environment, which we'll talk about in our first session. Obviously, some questions and thoughts around stakeholder engagement and working with students. But I thought this last one was maybe the most interesting just because of where it fell on the list. Financial performance has always been top of the list, but I think it has been sort of falling down the list, not because it's any less important, and certainly it's embedded in the fiduciary duty questions and embedded in all of this. But I think it shows in some ways that we're maybe moving past that question, that there's enough data and experience to show that these strategies do perform well as or better than traditional strategies, and that's less of a concern, but obviously still very central to all of these conversations. So with that, quick rapid fire context setting. It's my great pleasure to kick us off with our first panel and fireside chat. Very honored and thrilled to have Shivaram Rajgopal, Columbia University professor who's done a lot of work on these topics, and including speaking out and writing and really helping to add some clarity to the conversations in the context of some of the political backlash and media campaigns around ESG. So very pleased that he made the trip down to share his insights. And Andrew Poreda from Sage will be sharing some of their perspectives, also in the middle of much of this work in a fireside chat. So with that, I will hand it over to Andrew to get us going. Thank you.
ESG, all of you have probably heard in the news, what is ESG, right? And there's a lot of different opinions that go around when you hear the word letters ESG, right? It's just an acronym, environment, social, governance. But what does that mean to you? I think as an investor, we have to be very cognizant of what actually ESG means. And so I want to first off set the definition so that we can then have a conversation, right? There sometimes are ESGs as product in terms of like investment strategy, but then what I think is most important is ESG as a process. And I want to highlight that because a lot of the things we're going to talk about later today are about the process, and ESG fits into a lot of these discussions, right? Net zero, DEI, all these other topics. I think it's very important to set that stage. And so this is a process to both, one, act as a risk management tool, and two, identify future opportunities. And so why the need now? All of you probably have seen in the news lately, right? What was September? It was the hottest month on record for September ever. And the summer was also the hottest ever. What does that mean? These risks we see from the climate are not something that you as an investor are immune to. You are exposed to all of these risks in different ways. And I think that's the important part, is kind of knowing that everything that falls into these environmental, social, governance levels, they're all things that matter to you as investors. And so I think we have to make sure that we that are supportive of these, understand these issues, understand that these are, in terms of financial performance is gone, but these affect the financial performance. And so it's not woke, it's not greenwashing, these are issues that are integral to operating as an investor successfully. And so I think we have to be cognizant of that. But then also, we start talking about what's going on in the world in terms of the economy, right? Back in 1970s, PPE, plant, property, equipment, that was the name of the game. That was where the most value in terms of assets, like where companies had their, that was their bottom line. It was running those factories to make money, essentially. But now where are we, right? What is the value of companies? Back in 1975, on the S&P 500, 17% of the assets were intangible. And what I mean by intangible, I mean human capital, R&D, patents. Those were 17%. Anybody know what it is now in 2020? For on the books of the S&P 500, over 90%. So we have moved an economy to a largely service-based economy where instead of now looking at our plants, we now look at people. We look at what is our company worth in terms of intellectual property? So how do you measure that? Shiva here is an expert accountant. He's going to tell you, like, how does traditional accounting capture some of those risks and opportunities? Does it?
It doesn't.
It doesn't, right? And so that's the need of like why ESG is very important, and it's a evolving process. It's a work in progress, but it's integral to dealing with a lot of these issues as well as opportunities. So this is how we set the stage for that. And I think all of you've seen there's various places where ESG is under attack, right? Federal government, we see ESG under attack from different rules. Department of Labor trying to basically, we've had lawsuits to try to basically take away the ability to, as a fiduciary, consider ESG factors. That's under attack and still under attack. Fortunately, there was a bill, or excuse me, in Amarillo, Texas, the judge was actually one that you would think would side with the plaintiffs, struck it down and said, no, these are financial material issues. As a fiduciary, you should consider those things or have the ability to consider. And then we also see Supreme Court. We see now that even though DI being struck down by the Supreme Court, that affects college campuses, which all of you are very familiar with. The fear is, though, is that companies now may be next, right? And so this is an important thing. And so you start talking about people, right? And like issues like DEI, how does that affect, talk about, your corporate culture, all these other issues, your development of talent. Now you're telling me that we might not be able in the future to use those. So we're in a very contentious space. And so, Professor, I would like to see your take on, you've been on Capitol Hill, you've talked with critics, you've seen some of their insight. What do you see as the potential challenges, as also as what landscape do you see moving forward as terms of areas to be addressed in 2024, both from a pro-ESG perspective as well as a negative ESG perspective?
Thank you. So let me just step back a little bit, and first of all, thank you for having me here. This is much prettier than being at Columbia, so and much safer nowadays as well. So is there a big idea behind ESG, right? People often claim it's some kind of loose agglomeration of three terms put together by a UN committee, EN, SNG, do they all belong together? So I've thought a lot about what is the big idea. So let's start there, since we're at the beginning of the conference and so on. And again, I'm going to use a classic income statement analogy. How many of you actually read 10Ks? Sometimes. Thank God, at least some of them do. The others need to take an accounting class. So let's step back. So what are the big ideas? I think there are three big ideas behind ESG. Idea number one, so if you look at, say, an income statement of Coca-Cola, right? Lots of businesses use some version of natural capital. Now, what does Coca-Cola do? It uses water, it uses soil. We all know about carbon. By and large, we set the cost of natural capital in our income statements to zero. Now, I don't know how to value natural capital, but I know it's not zero. So that's the first observation. The second observation is that the reporting model in general does a pretty poor job of capturing externalities. What does that mean? Passive smoking is an externality. Carbon's an externality. But there are also positive externalities that companies create. Now think about Zoom. How much do you pay for a license to get Zoom? I don't know, like $100 a month, a year, whatever. The value that Zoom adds to your life is like 10 times more or 20 times more. Vaccine. Pfizer, for instance, of course, the CEO at Pfizer made a lot of money. BioNTech made a lot of money. But the money that they saved all of us by stopping, COVID, perhaps maybe 6, 8, 9, 10 months before, was huge. So we ignored both negative and positive externalities. So ESG need not be a defensive conversation, is the point. And the last point, increasingly worry that the link between the owner and the manager nowadays is almost non-existent. What do I mean by that? Passive indexing, is fantastic for all of us as individuals. I'm not so sure about what it does in the entire system. Who's reading a 10K anymore? Most of us are basically buying labels. Who's policing the label? I often joke when I go to a grocery store, what am I buying? Natural or eggs, for instance, right? I'm a vegan, but I eat eggs. So omega-6, omega-3, free range, I have no idea. It's the exact same problem with the world of mutual funds. Not just ESG. What is value? What is quality? How many of us have seen a definition of quality in a quality ETF? So the third idea here being managerial accountability, right? So to me, as a framework, these are the three big ideas or four big ideas that ESG tries to hit. Now, the practice of ESG, sadly, politely put, is a work in process, right? It's measurements complicated. There's hardly any clarity on what one needs to do. What is your focus? If you're an E fund, maybe you'll put money into Tesla. If you care about S, maybe not so much. With G, who knows how to think about G for Elon Musk? Is he a mad genius? Is he mad? Is he a genius? Who knows? But and that's the other issue. We don't talk about G anymore. G is like arguably the most important of the three letters. And have we just given up on G? Maybe. Who knows? But I can just go on and on. So to me, that's the big issue, and the dispute and Capitol Hill kind of idea. One of the nice things about Capitol Hill is that it's a evidence-free, fact-free conversation. Unlike even a classroom, people just say anything they want, frankly. So one way to crystallize that in my mind is that the anti-ESG crowd probably worries about next year's EPS. The pro-ESG crowd perhaps worries about 20, 30, 40 years out EPS. So, which is the other conversation we should have. How much of this is values versus value? How do these things interact? And if you're investing for values, that's fine. Just know what the trade-offs are, basically. That's the other problem. We don't want to talk about, we have a world of trade-off denial, right? There is no such thing as a free lunch. So anyway, I'll stop there.
I would say that any of you want to talk offline about Tesla, Elon Musk might be bugging my house being out of Austin. But I do think that, hit it on the head. You guys all saw FTX scandal that emerged, right? That was just bad governance in action. And I would say that, in my mind, and it's open for debate, I think that you have to really understand too that they're all linked together, right, to the bottom line of the company. And sometimes EN issues are a trade-off, right? You might, if you're a utility company and you push for more renewable power, it may cost your consumers more from a kilowatt hour perspective, right? So there are going to be trade-offs sometimes. It's not always a win-win, and that has to be managed together, right? And so ESG is an integral part, but it shouldn't be just looked at standalone from a company and how it operates. But I do think that that's a key point. But I do think also for all of you in the room, the idea of values versus value is a hugely important topic. And sometimes they do align. And so as you start looking at these, as your endowments all have missions usually associated with financial performance, think about an issue like climate change. They're divesting from fossil fuels, hugely important topic, right? And some may say that we have a moral imperative to divest from fossil fuels and we'll act on it. That can also, though, be, even though that's a mission and part of that statement, it can also have financial performance impacts. And we've actually seen that pension funds that divested actually did better than those that didn't, right? As you talk about what timeline you're operating at, endowments, how long do you want your college campus to be around for? Hopefully 100 years from now. And so even in the short term, when oil and gas is doing very well, it may make sense from a long-term perspective to look past that and to see what's going to be successful in a future economy. So there are sometimes where values and values can align. I think it just has to be clear from all of you in the room. If you're a trustee, why are you making certain actions? When you develop your investment policy statements and you start thinking about how you're actually operating, have those conversations. Look at, what am I doing? Am I doing this just to enact a cause? Am I doing it for financial performance? Am I balancing it? I think it's very key to have those discussions because I think it'll help guide you as a trustee moving forward. And so I can't underestimate that enough. But I also, though, in terms of thinking of this, you start talking about 2024 and beyond. Where are you seeing like areas that maybe there could be bipartisan support, where there could be an interest from both sides, where we can kind of see things on the same page, though it may not look like that now? I think when you start pulling it back, there is a lot of room for agreement on some of these issues. Do you see any sort of, aha moments where you think people can get, we're obviously very supportive here in this room mostly, but, going across the aisle, so to speak, like where can we kind of find, common ground?
Well, I have modest expectations, right? We can start with human capital. Maybe that's how can you be against treating people well? And hopefully, we don't need more evidence to show that motivated people actually map into future cash flows. But having said that, again, I'm going to go back to our reporting model. Barely 15% of US companies actually tell you what their compensation costs are. Okay, seriously. I don't know compensation costs for about 85% of the US companies. They just don't tell you. So even before we get excited about things like turnover, skills, productivity, which is stuff that we would like to know, it would be a nice start to at least know the dollar amount of compensation costs. So the FASB's kind of finally pushed that through after a lot of pressure. The intangibles problem. We've had an intangibles reporting problem since the days of NASDAQ, by definition. The whole point of NASDAQ was to set up companies that don't necessarily make accounting profits, right? It's been like 50 years. We've done a lot of things in 50 years, and we can't seem to figure out how to put intangible assets on the balance sheet somehow. So part of the problem, I would say, again, there's like a $40 trillion AUM coalition pushing for climate reporting. There's not even 1 trillion worrying about what shows up on a 10K. So if there's one thing all of you could do, read 10Ks, put pressure, because you're the customers. Investors are barely represented in this rulemaking process. It's usually, in my mind, captured by CFOs and auditors. Maybe intangibles, maybe human capital. You can do a lot more, but let's start there.
Yeah, and I would say this too, since I think this is very important to the room here. So we talk about ESG. One of the big things that may not get talked about in that construct is this idea of stewardship, right? There is so much you can do with your investments that's not just buying and selling certain stocks and bonds. And I think that's one of the key things is looking at how can I be an active owner, right? There's passive funds. That does not mean that you can't be an active owner. And I think there's a big distinction there. So when you engage with companies on certain issues, like I said, demand more information on the 10K. If that's something that you feel is important, work through those proper channels. And if you have the ability to vote on certain issues, be educated, but actually exercise that vote if you have the ability to do so, because these are huge, important issues. And a lot of times we see actually a pushback in the industry as a whole, where people are trying to be more passive and hands-off and trying to push it to somebody else to make the decision. And so if you have the ability to make a decision, I would own it and not try to pass it to somebody else. So I'm happy to talk about that, in smaller groups, but I do think that's a huge important topic that is not necessarily always focused on, and it's more the what are you holding, what are you not holding? Because I would say this, if you also want impact, sometimes investing in high emitting sectors, if you want to impact climate change, that's the place to do it. So there are other ways to look at it. So don't always just be set in terms of what you buy and sell. There are plenty other ways also to have impact and influence in your investments.
Engagement? Yeah, we can talk about engagement if you like. So we can talk about anything.
I think we're
throw me a prompt. Yeah, no.
Cognizant of time, but I think the goal is here is that there's a lot. We want you to be supportive, and I do think in these small group settings, please ask those questions. There are things that we all will not agree on. I'm hoping to talk to the professor offline about an issue that's important to me in terms of we see California. They placed a bill that requires Scope 3 emissions as part of their package, climate disclosure as well as then Scope 3. Personally, it's going to be a contentious topic. It's something that many people probably have never had to look at, but it's the idea that we want to report on emissions across the entire value chain. So conceptually, it sounds really important, right? You think about fossil fuels, right? You get it out of the ground, you give it to the customer, and then ultimately it's off your books from a climate accounting perspective. And now the consumer is the one that gets to use it. Obviously, that's problematic, but there are issues with reporting. So sometimes too is what you demand, you have to be careful is, are we demanding too much and are we having smart conversations in terms of disclosure? Is it reasonable? We can't just always ask for everything. So I think that's too, when you start having a company, the same thing applies, right? You can't say just yes to every want and need. It's a finite balance that you have to be able to be cognizant of. So that's the other part too that I think when you think about these, you have those priorities, right? You see net zero, JEDI, financial performance, you're trying to balance all of them. Think about that careful dance and understand how some of them may have different, you can only ask for so many things, and it sometimes is a difficult challenge to say yes to everything. And that could be also the same with your investments too, in terms of,
So just a couple of quick comments on California, if you want. Are we done?
You can do it.
Okay, sorry, let's go to questions.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So you touched on FASB. So IFRS is
IFRS, that's the international version.
They've adopted the SASB standards as a foundation. Will that ever happen with FASB?
You mean the ISSB that got set up?
Yeah.
No. Well, I don't know. Maybe, but yeah. All four-letter words, right? So IFRS simply means okay. So when you write a scorecard, you need some kind of rules of the game to actually figure out what the score means, right? Those things are called another four-letter word, GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. So in the US we have US GAAP, which arguably works very well, except for the intangibles issue and a few other issues. So the rest of the world, everybody had their own way of keeping score. And then there was a push a while back to harmonize this. That is IFRS. So think of IFRS as international accounting principles. Hopefully everybody here knows the SASB. So IFRS, when there's a move to kind of integrate IFRS and SASB, call it integrated reporting, meaning the financial stuff doesn't have to live in a silo compared to the other risk management type stuff. And overseas, now we have something called the ISSB. Think of that as IFRS plus SASB or something like that. A happy marriage, which created an ISSB. So the question is, will we see something like that in the US? I mean, I think the political pushback is massive. In my view, the FASB, as I said, I'm not sure there's much investor representation on the FASB. So unless you guys ask for it, the preparers and the auditors don't want any of this. It's very hard to audit a scope 3 emission, especially in a litigious environment like the US. Why would I bother if I'm an auditor to kind of certify any of that? Right? So unless we solve the underlying economic tensions, litigation, more demand from users and investors to push rule makers, it's going to be a hard slog. For him, for me, yeah. Uh-huh.
You could wave a magic wand.
What do you do? It's not difficult. I mean, it's a trivial problem, frankly. I mean, so consider, say, the pharma model, right? So you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 or something. You go through the whole FDA process. So what is the big idea? Why did we start expensing R&D? So back in the day when the rule was written, and that's why it's so ossified, right? In the 60s and the 70s, the idea was that R&D is risky. Nobody says it doesn't lead to profits, but it's risky. So accounting is driven by conservatism. So if you're conservative, you don't book this as an asset. Where did this conservatism come from? Mostly creditors and auditors, because if you put an asset on the books, the auditor doesn't want to really go and certify that this is really worth what it is. So just follow that model. I would say the easiest thing to do is let the manager decide. 80% of the time, managers won't lie. There will, of course, be 20% of the folks who will lie, but that's what the ecosystem is supposed to work. What is the board doing? Where are sell-side analysts? What about short sellers? So the ecosystem in general, by and large, keeps the system honest. So even if 20% of them overstate the value of their intangible, that's fine. We'll figure it out. But to avoid maybe 10 or 20% of managers from overstating the numbers, we're actually doing a massive disservice by leaving out arguably 90% of the value from our balance sheets. And when you leave stuff out, narrative takes over. How do I even know if Amazon is correctly priced? Because the manager is always going to spin some narrative. And how do I stress test the narrative? I'm a trust but verify kind of guy. If I don't trust, I become too cynical. But I'd like to verify.
So something like capitalized software.
Yeah, something like that. And there's a feasibility constraint. Part of the problem here is that the auditors, in my mind, don't want to exercise professional judgment. Write me a rule so I don't get sued. It's their business model. Well, yes, they're very successful at that, but there's a cost that the others bear. And investors, in my mind, are simply not vocal enough. If there were a $1 trillion AUM coalition to push for intangibles, you'll get it. You don't need 40 trillion.
Who's doing the best work figuring out how to price natural capital?
Externalities. Who's doing the best work? Who's doing any work?
Initiatives. I think there's one at Harvard Business School.
Well, it's a complicated problem, right? What is the social cost of carbon? The Biden administration put a number like $185 or something. There were lawsuits on that. I think the perfect is the enemy of the good, partly. Start somewhere, like say $100 number. I don't know whether it's 100 or 185, but it's not $10. That's the price of these offsets these days. So start somewhere commonsensical, or at least start with some low-hanging fruit. Let's fix intangibles. Let's probably fix human capital. We at least have some conversation about social cost of carbon. How do you think about water? It's a local issue. For example, Coca-Cola says it's water neutral. I can understand carbon neutral. I don't know what water neutral means, right? What's the point in taking water away from a place that needs it and replenishing it in a different country, for instance? So what's the social cost of unrecycled plastic? I don't know. But at least let's start somewhere. It's not the price. It's not zero, right? At least start with some range. Common sense tells us maybe it's between 100 and 120 in the case of carbon. Start with 150. It doesn't have to be precise. Otherwise, you'll never make any progress. Part of the problem in my mind, apologies to all the NGOs in the room, this area has too many NGOs. NGOs like perfection. Now, sometimes NGOs don't want to talk about trade-offs.
We are out of time, but I will offline love talking to you about that from what investors are doing. I think the effort is starting. The accuracy of it is still work in progress, but there are starting to be some ground up movement on that particular topic. So happy to talk about that later.
Thank you.